The black ships came like death itself, sliding through space with silent menace. For 200 years, the Veltar Empire had owned the stars. 17 different worlds knelt before their might. Every planet, every moon, every space station paid the price of fear. The Veltar were not kind rulers. They were reptiles with cold yellow eyes and forked tongues that tasted fear in the air. Their skin looked like old leather, and their claws could tear through metal. They built their empire on one simple rule: obey or die. Every world that tried to fight them became a warning to others. Entire cities turned to glass, millions dead in minutes. On Haven 7, a small mining world at the edge of nowhere, humans dug crystals from deep underground. The planet was ugly and hot, with red dirt that stuck to everything and 2 suns that never seemed to set. But it was home now. It had to be. Jin Ho had been digging here for 8 years. His hands were rough and scarred from handling sharp crystal ore. His back ached every morning when he woke up in the small metal hut he shared with his family. But he kept working, because that was what humans did. They survived. His wife Sora worked in the processing plant where the raw crystals got cleaned and sorted. The work was dangerous. One wrong move and the cutting machines could take off a finger. But Sora was careful and smart. She had steady hands and never complained, even when the Veltar guards shouted at the workers to move faster. Their daughter Ye Jin was 12 and already working part-time in the settlement school. She helped teach the younger kids their letters and numbers. The Veltar allowed basic education because smart slaves were more useful than dumb ones. But Ye Jin was teaching the children other things too, things the guards did not need to know about. Little Tai Min was only 6 years old. He was too young to work, so he spent his days playing near the mining sites while his father loaded heavy carts with ore. The boy had made toys from scrap metal and broken crystal pieces. His favorite was a small spaceship he had built from wire and colored glass. He would fly it around and make whooshing sounds, pretending to pilot it through the stars every morning at sunrise. All the humans had to gather in the main square. Commander Grixenal would stand on a metal platform and give his daily speech. He was bigger than the other Veltar, with darker scales and longer claws. Scars covered his face from old battles. When he spoke, his voice carried across the settlement like thunder. "Another day begins," Grixenal would announce, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the morning air. "You live because we allow it. You breathe because we permit it. Remember this always." The humans would bow their heads and listen. They had learned not to look directly at him. Eye contact was seen as challenge, and challenges brought punishment, so they stared at the ground and nodded when he spoke. But Grixenal never noticed the small things. He did not see how Jin Ho counted the guards during each speech. He did not notice that Sora always stood where she could see the main gate. He missed the way Ye Jin quietly moved between the adults, passing whispered messages. The Veltar thought humans were simple creatures who only cared about food and safety. They were wrong. The humans of Haven 7 remembered things. They remembered which guards were lazy and which ones were cruel. They remembered the times when supply ships arrived and how long they stayed. They remembered the layout of every building, every door, every emergency exit. Most importantly, they remembered what life was like before the Veltar came. At night, when the guards thought everyone was asleep, quiet conversations happened in the darkness. Fathers told their children stories about Earth, the blue world, where humans came from. Mothers sang old songs that their grandmothers had taught them, and sometimes, very quietly, they talked about other things, about the way things used to be, about the way things could be again. Jin Ho would hold little Tai Min close during these conversations. The boy would listen with wide eyes as his father told him about green grass and blue oceans, about cities that touched the clouds and ships that could travel between stars without fear. "Will we ever see it, Papa?" Tai Min would whisper. "Maybe," Jin Ho would answer softly. "Maybe someday." The Veltar commander believed he controlled everything on Haven 7, but he did not control the one thing that mattered most: hope. And hope, as he would soon learn, was the most dangerous thing in the universe. The alarm bells rang at dawn, sharp and angry, like metal birds screaming. Jin Ho dropped his breakfast and grabbed his work clothes. Surprise inspections meant trouble. They always did. Veltar soldiers poured into the settlement like black water flooding the streets. Their heavy boots clanked against the metal walkways. Each soldier carried a plasma rifle that hummed with deadly energy. Their yellow eyes swept over everything, looking for reasons to punish someone. Commander Grixenal walked in the center of the group, his scarred face twisted in permanent anger. He moved slowly, like a predator that knew its prey could not escape. Behind him came the inspection drones, floating metal spheres that recorded everything they saw. "All workers report to stations immediately," a soldier barked through his helmet. Speaker. No exceptions, no delays. Jinho rushed to the crystal sorting area, where mountains of raw ore waited to be processed. The purple crystals were the most valuable, but also the most fragile. One wrong touch and they would crack into worthless pieces. His hands shook slightly as he began separating the different types of ore. Little Taemin had followed his father to work that morning. The boy often came along when there was no school. Usually he would sit quietly in the corner and play with his toy spaceship. But today was different. Today he wanted to help. "Papa, let me carry the small ones," Taemin said, reaching for a handful of purple crystals. "Be very careful," Jinho whispered, his eyes watching the approaching soldiers. "These break easily." The boy nodded seriously and picked up 3 small purple stones. They glowed softly in his small hands, like captured starlight. He had carried crystals before, but never during an inspection. Never when the air felt so heavy with danger. Grixnal entered the sorting area just as Taemin was walking toward the collection bin. The commander's presence filled the space like poisonous gas. Other workers stopped what they were doing and bowed their heads. The silence was thick and suffocating. Taemin tried to bow like the adults, but he was still holding the crystals. As he bent forward, one of the purple stones slipped from his tiny fingers. Time seemed to slow as the crystal tumbled through the air. It hit the metal floor with a sound like breaking glass. The pieces scattered across the ground, glowing for a moment before fading to dull gray. A whole week's wages destroyed in an instant. Grixnal's yellow eyes locked onto the boy. His forked tongue flicked out, tasting the fear in the air. A smile spread across his reptilian face, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of something that enjoyed causing pain. "Wasteful creature," he said, his voice low and deadly. Jinho stepped forward without thinking. His body moved before his mind could stop him. "Please, Commander," he said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "He's just a child. He didn't mean to—" "Silence," Grixnal hissed. His hand moved to the plasma pistol at his side. "This little animal has cost the Empire valuable resources." Sora appeared from nowhere, pushing through the crowd of workers. Her face was pale but determined. "Take me instead," she said. "I'm his mother. I should have been watching him." Other humans began stepping forward. Old Minsu, who had worked the mines for 20 years. Young Haewon, barely 18 but already strong from hard labor. Even little Ye Jin pushed through the crowd, her 12-year-old face set with desperate courage. "He's just a baby," Ye Jin said, her voice cracking. "Please don't hurt my brother." Grixnal looked at all of them with cold amusement. He had seen this before on other worlds. Humans always tried to protect each other. It was one of their many weaknesses. "You think your feelings matter to me?" he asked, drawing his weapon. The plasma pistol charged with a high, whining sound. "You think I care about your family bonds?" Taemin looked up at the big alien towering over him. The boy was scared, but he tried to be brave like his father had taught him. His toy spaceship was still in his other hand, the one not covered in crystal dust. "I'm sorry," Taemin whispered. "I didn't mean to break it." Those were the last words he ever spoke. The plasma bolt lit up the room like lightning. The energy hit the child in the chest, and his small body fell like a broken doll. The toy spaceship clattered to the floor beside him. Its wire wings bent and twisted. Sora's scream tore through the air like a wounded animal. She dropped to her knees beside her son, gathering his still form against her chest. Her voice echoed, off the metal walls, raw and terrible, and filled with a pain that seemed to crack the world itself. But then something strange happened. The screaming stopped. The crying stopped. Even the sounds of breathing seemed to fade away. The settlement fell into a silence that was deeper than death itself. Grixnal had expected chaos. He had expected weeping and begging and the usual broken surrender that came after such demonstrations. He lived for those moments when other species finally understood their place in his universe. But this silence was different. This quiet had weight to it, like storm clouds gathering before lightning strikes. He looked around at the human faces surrounding him. What he saw there made something cold crawl up his spine. It was not fear in their eyes. It was not despair or hopelessness or defeat. It was something the Veltar Empire had never faced before. Something that would haunt Grixinal's dreams for the rest of his very short life. Cold, calculating, patient fury. The kind of anger that does not burn hot and fade quickly. The kind that grows stronger with time, like metal being forged in fire. The kind that remembers everything and forgives nothing. In that moment, though he did not know it yet, Commander Grixinal had just signed his own death warrant. And the death warrant of his entire empire. The message traveled like wildfire through space, but not through the official channels the Veltar monitored. It moved through maintenance frequencies, hidden in routine work reports. It whispered through coded conversations between transport pilots. It spread through the ancient human network that the aliens had never bothered to understand. People who cared about other people. On the ice mining station of Frost Point, Jung-Sik was cutting through frozen methane when his communicator crackled, with what sounded like a routine maintenance update. But hidden in the technical language was something else entirely. A 6-year-old boy named Tae-min had been murdered on Haven 7 for dropping a crystal. Jung-Sik's cutting tool went silent. Around him, other miners stopped their work as the message spread from person to person. These were hard people, men and women, who had worked in the frozen hell of space for years. They rarely showed emotion. But now tears froze on their faces. As they stood in the icy tunnels, 12 systems away on the agricultural world of Green Valley, farmer Dong Hyun received the news while harvesting grain for the Veltar food reserves. His weathered hands gripped his harvesting tool until his knuckles turned white. Around him, other workers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices. The alien overseers noticed the humans working more slowly, but they assumed it was just laziness. They were wrong. In the asteroid belt mining complex known as Rock Garden, former Earth Defense Force Sergeant Hyun Woo was welding support beams when the message reached him. He had been a soldier once, before the Veltar came. Now he fixed broken equipment and pretended to be just another broken slave. But Hyun Woo remembered things the aliens wished he would forget. He remembered tactics and strategies. He remembered how to turn everyday tools into weapons. Most importantly, he remembered how to teach others. Gather around, he told his work crew that evening, when the Veltar guards were busy with their own affairs. I want to show you some new maintenance procedures. The humans crowded close as Hyun Woo began his lesson. To anyone watching, it looked like basic equipment training. How to properly disconnect power systems, how to identify structural weak points, how to disable safety systems for routine cleaning, but the workers understood what they were really learning. How to sabotage, how to disable enemy equipment, how to strike without being caught. Remember, Hyun Woo said quietly, these procedures are very important. Practice them every day and teach them to others. On the factory world of New Busan, Su-jin worked the assembly lines that built components for Veltar warships. She was small and quiet, the kind of person the guards barely noticed. But before the invasion, she had been a communications officer in the Earth Defense Network. She knew how to organize people without creating suspicion. We're having a cultural meeting tonight, she told her bunkmates, to share stories from home, help us remember who we are. The meetings started small, just a few dozen workers gathering in an unused storage room. They would sing old songs from Earth and tell stories about the world they had lost. The Veltar guards who occasionally checked on them saw nothing threatening, just homesick humans trying to feel better. But between the songs and stories, other things were shared. Technical knowledge from engineers, military experience from former soldiers, intelligence about guard rotations and security weaknesses. The cultural meetings became recruitment sessions. The songs became coded messages. Most importantly, they shared a name, Tae-min, a 6-year-old boy who had died for dropping a crystal. His story spread from world to world, person to person, until every human in Veltar space knew his name. Remember, Taimin became more than just words. It became a battle cry whispered in the darkness. On transport ships traveling between systems, human crew members began having equipment problems. Navigation systems would mysteriously fail, forcing ships to dock at unexpected stations. Cargo manifest computers would develop glitches, mixing up shipment destinations. Communication arrays would suffer interference that somehow always seemed to help human messages get through. The Veltar ship captains blamed human stupidity. They never suspected that former Earth Navy engineers were carefully breaking their ships in ways that looked like accidents. Young Minjun worked on one such transport, pretending to be just another maintenance worker, but he had graduated from the Earth Naval Academy before the war. He knew these ships better than their alien captains did. Each mistake he made was perfectly calculated to help the growing resistance. Equipment failures began happening across the Empire. Mining equipment would break down at crucial moments. Factory machines would develop mysterious problems that took days to fix. Power systems would suffer unexplained outages. The Veltar commanders were annoyed but not alarmed. Humans had always been clumsy with technology, they thought. These failures were just proof that the slave species needed constant supervision. They never noticed the pattern. The failures always happened at important moments. The breakdowns always affected critical systems. The delays always seemed to help human workers communicate with each other. In the deeper parts of space, on the prison ships were the most dangerous. Humans were kept. Former military officers began sharing their knowledge with civilians. Teachers learned about weapons. Farmers learned about tactics. Children learned about the importance of staying quiet and following orders when the time came. Even the youngest humans carried the message. In the slave schools where human children learned to read and write, teachers began adding new lessons to the curriculum. Mathematics that included calculating explosive charges. History lessons about famous battles and resistance movements. Science classes that covered chemistry and electronics in very practical ways. The Veltar education monitors saw nothing wrong with these lessons. They wanted humans to be smart enough to be useful. They never realized they were creating an army. On every world, in every station, in every ship, humans began preparing. They stockpiled supplies in hidden locations. They identified weapons and equipment that could be stolen or sabotaged. They mapped escape routes and weak points in enemy defenses. Most importantly, they planned. Former soldiers drew up battle strategies. Engineers designed weapons from scrap materials. Communications experts created secure networks that could coordinate actions across multiple star systems. The Veltar Empire had ruled through fear for 2 centuries. They had crushed rebellions before they could start by making examples of anyone who showed defiance. Their system had always worked because most species valued survival above freedom, but they had never dealt with humans before. They had never faced a species that could turn grief into rage, and rage into careful, patient planning. The death of one small boy had awakened something the galaxy had never seen before. An entire species united by love, driven by loss and organized for war. The humans were coming, and they would not be slaves anymore. The clocks across 47 worlds all showed the same time, 3 in the morning, Galactic Standard. In that moment when most of the Veltar guards were asleep and their defenses were at their weakest, hell broke loose across the entire empire. On Haven 7, Jin-Ho crept through the maintenance tunnels beneath the command center. His hands moved with practiced silence along pipes and cables he had repaired 1,000 times. Behind him followed 20 other humans, each one carrying makeshift weapons built from mining tools and scrap metal. They knew every inch of these tunnels because they had built them, fixed them and cleaned them for 8 long years. Sora moved through the processing plant like a shadow. The machines she had operated every day became her allies now. She knew which power couplings to disconnect, which coolant lines to cut, which safety systems to override. The factory floor that had been her prison was now her weapon. 12-year-old Ye Jin led a group of children through the air vents above the guard barracks. She was small enough to fit where adults could not go. In her hands she carried homemade smoke bombs, built from cleaning chemicals and mining explosives. The vents she had crawled through to deliver messages were now her highway to victory. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on dozens of worlds. On the ice stations, humans used cutting torches to slice through critical support beams. On the factory worlds, workers turned assembly line machines into weapons of mass destruction. On transport ships, crew members locked alien officers in their quarters and took control of the vessels. The Veltar had made a fatal mistake. They had forced humans to work on every critical system in their empire. Every power plant, every communication array, every weapon system had human fingerprints on it. The slaves knew their master's empire, better than the masters themselves. Jungsik stood in the power control room of Frostpoint mining station. Around him, walls of switches and displays controlled the energy that kept 10,000 beings alive in the frozen hell of space. He had maintained these systems for 6 years. Now he began shutting them down one by one. "Emergency power to essential systems only," he announced over the station intercom, his voice calm and professional. But the Veltar guards running through. The corridors in the darkness did not know that Jungsik himself decided what counted as essential. Life support for human quarters stayed on. Weapon systems went dark. Communication arrays died. Security doors locked with aliens on the wrong side. On New Busan, Su Jin walked into the main communication center carrying a toolbox. The night, shift guards barely looked at her. She was just another human technician coming to fix something. They had no idea she was about to cut their empire's throat. Her hands moved quickly across control panels she knew by heart. Communication satellites began changing their frequencies. Military channels started broadcasting children's songs from Earth. Most importantly, the secure command frequencies that connected Veltar officers across the sector all began playing. The same message over and over. "Remember time in, remember time in, remember time in." In the asteroid mining complex, Hyunwoo led his team through the armory they had been forbidden to enter. But locks meant nothing when you knew how to bypass them. The former sergeant moved with military precision, distributing weapons to people who had spent months learning how to use them. "Remember your training," he told his squad as they prepared to assault the command bunker. "We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every child who died, every parent who cried, every person who suffered under their rule." The humans moved like professional soldiers because many of them had been professional soldiers. The Veltar had scattered Earth's military across their empire, thinking that separation would make them harmless. Instead, they had planted military expertise on every world they controlled. Transport ships throughout the sector began receiving distress calls. "Engine failure, human," crew members reported, requesting immediate assistance. When Veltar rescue vessels arrived, they found themselves surrounded by ships full of humans who had been waiting for this moment for years. Captain Dong Hyun, who had once commanded a destroyer in the Earth Defense Fleet, stood on the bridge of a captured transport vessel. Around him, former naval officers worked at stations they had secretly learned to operate. The ship that had carried them as slaves now served as their weapon. Back on Haven 7, Jin Ho emerged from the maintenance tunnels directly inside the command center. The Veltar guards were running around in panic, trying to understand why their communications were dead and their weapons would not function. They never saw the humans rising from the floors, dropping from the ceilings, emerging from every shadow. Sora appeared in the doorway, her work clothes replaced by improvised armor, made from metal plates. In her hands she carried a plasma rifle taken from a guard who would never need it again. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with the fire of a mother's revenge. "Secure the building," Jinho called out to his people. "No one gets out. No one calls for help." The battle for the command center lasted exactly 12 minutes. The Veltar guards found themselves fighting enemies who knew the building better than they did, who appeared from passages that were not on any map, who struck from angles that should have been impossible. Commander Grixnal barricaded himself in his private office, frantically trying to contact other Veltar installations. But every communication channel brought the same news: rebellion on Kepler Station, uprising on Frost Point, revolution on New Busan, 47 worlds burning with human rage. His private communicator crackled to life. A human voice spoke, calm and deadly cold. "Commander Grixnal." The Veltar recognized the voice. It was Jin Ho, the broken slave who had begged for his child's life just days before. "How?" Grixnal hissed into the communicator. "You're just laborers, farmers, maintenance workers. How are you doing this?" Jin Ho's reply came through the static like a judge pronouncing sentence. "You killed our child. You thought it would make us afraid. Instead, you taught us that we had nothing left to lose. You scattered our soldiers across your empire, thinking distance would make them weak. Instead, you gave us military leaders on every world. You forced us to learn your systems, thinking knowledge would make us better slaves. Instead, you gave us the keys to your destruction." The sound of plasma fire echoed through the command center. Veltar voices screamed in panic and pain. "You ruled through fear," Jin Ho continued, his voice growing closer as he approached the barricaded office. "But you never understood what you were dealing with. Humans don't just fight for territory or resources. We fight for love, for memory, for justice, and most of all, we fight for our children." The office door exploded inward. Through the smoke and fire, Grixnal saw Jin Ho standing in the doorway. Behind him stood Sora and Yejin, and dozens of other humans whose faces burned with righteous fury. "His name was Tai Min," Jin Ho said quietly, "and because you killed him, your empire dies today." 17 days. That was all it took for 2 centuries of Veltar rule to crumble into dust and memory. On worlds across the sector, black warships sat empty in their docking bays. Their crews had fled in the night, abandoning colonies and stations as human voices filled the communication channels with victory songs. The mighty empire that had crushed hope from countless civilizations could not survive the fury of parents who had lost their child. Commander Grixnal knelt in the wreckage of what had once been his command center. Broken screens flickered around, him showing the collapse of everything he had built. His uniform was torn and bloodied. His scales, once polished and proud, were dull with dust and defeat. Jin Ho stood over him, holding a plasma rifle. It was the same model that had killed little Taemin just weeks before. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, but his grip was steady. Around them, the sounds of celebration echoed through the settlement as humans who had been slaves just hours ago now danced in the streets. "Please," Grixnal wheezed, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air one last time. "I was following orders. The Empire demanded obedience." Jin Ho's face remained calm, but his eyes held the weight of every sleepless night since his son's death. "You had a choice," he said quietly. "You chose to kill a child to make a point. Now you learn the price of that choice." Through the broken windows, they could see Veltar transport ships launching into space, their engines glowing bright against the stars. The aliens were running back to whatever holes they had crawled out of centuries ago. But they would find no safety there. Human ships were already moving to follow them, carrying messages that would echo across the galaxy. The age of Veltar domination was over. Sora entered the ruined command center, stepping carefully over chunks of metal and sparking cables. In her hands she carried something small and precious. Taemin's toy spaceship, the one he had been holding when he died. The wireframe was bent and the colored glass was cracked, but she had kept it safe through all the fighting. "This belonged to our son," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. His name was Tai Min. He was 6 years old. He liked to pretend he was flying through the stars, visiting distant worlds and meeting friendly aliens. She knelt down so she was eye level with the defeated commander. He would have grown up to be a good man, maybe an engineer like his father, maybe a teacher like his sister. He would have had children of his own someday and told them stories about the stars. Grixnal tried to look away, but Sora's voice held him like chains. "You took all of that away in a single moment," she continued. "You killed a child's dreams because you were angry about a broken crystal. Now 47 worlds are free because of what you did. Millions of beings will live better lives because you chose to murder one small boy." Across the settlement, humans were emerging from hiding places they had built over years of careful planning. Weapons caches hidden in maintenance tunnels, communication equipment buried beneath floor panels, medical supplies stored in forgotten storage rooms. They had been preparing for this day longer than anyone knew. Yejin ran through the streets, no longer the quiet child who had helped teach in the settlement school. She carried messages between the different human groups, coordinating the cleanup operations. At 12 years old, she had become a veteran of war. But, unlike the adults, around her she could still smile. She had helped avenge her little brother. News arrived from other worlds through the restored communication networks. On Frost Point, Young-Sik had been elected as the new station commander by unanimous vote. The ice miners who had once worked in slavery now controlled one of the richest energy sources in the sector. On New Busan, Su-Jin stood before a council of representatives from a dozen different species. The factory workers who had built weapons for their oppressors now led a coalition government that stretched across 3 star systems. In the asteroid mining complex, former Sergeant Hyun Woo had been promoted to general by an army that consisted entirely of former slaves. His first order had been to hunt down every Veltar officer who had committed crimes against civilians. His second order had been to destroy every slave collar, every prison ship, every symbol of the empire that had stolen so many lives. The other species who had lived under Veltar rule watched in amazement as humans shared power instead of hoarding it. On worlds where multiple races had been enslaved together, humans insisted on equal representation in the new governments. They built schools that taught the languages and cultures of all species. They created laws that protected the weak instead of empowering the strong. But most importantly, they built monuments. On every world that had been touched by the rebellion, humans erected simple stone markers with the same inscription. Remember Taimin. Never again. The Veltar had ruled through fear because they believed that terror was the ultimate weapon. They had built their empire on the assumption that all species valued survival above everything else. They thought that threatening to hurt the weak would keep the strong in line. They had never understood humans before that day. They had never realized that humans formed bonds that went deeper than logic or self-preservation. They had never learned the most dangerous truth about humanity. When you hurt their children, they stop caring about their own safety. Jinho looked down at the defeated commander one last time. The plasma rifle in his hands could end the alien's life with a single pull of the trigger. Justice demanded it. Revenge craved it. But something else stayed his hand. You will live, he said finally. You will live and remember what your cruelty cost. You will spend every day knowing that an empire that lasted for centuries fell because you killed one small boy. And when you die, you will die knowing that his name will be remembered long after yours is forgotten. He turned away from the broken alien and walked toward his family. Sora took his hand, and together they walked out into the sunlight where their daughter waited. Around them, the settlement bustled with the sounds of freedom being born. Above them, the stars shone brighter than they had in centuries. No longer did black warships patrol the space lanes like mechanical vultures. No longer did fear rule the galaxy. Children across 47 worlds played in streets that had once been filled with soldiers. They laughed and ran and dreamed of futures that their parents had fought to give them. And in human settlements throughout the sector, parents told their children a story about a little boy named Taimin, whose death had freed the galaxy, whose memory had toppled an empire, whose name would never be forgotten as long as humans drew breath among the stars. The price of a child's life, it turned out, was everything.